The morning is gray and wet, the kind of Norman summer morning that turns the Bocage into a world of dripping shadow. It is July of 1944, somewhere in the triangle of ground between St. Lo and Purriers, and a German sniper of the 2nd SS Panzerdivision Das Reich has been in his position since before first light. He found it the night before, working by memory and touch along the sunken lane, pressing into the bank where the roots of a centuries-old hedgerow grasped the earth like hands. He is wearing an oak-leaf patterned smock, green side-out, designed by a Munich art professor who understood that the human eye locks on a uniform tone and consistent shape, and that a garment could be made to dissolve against summer foliage if its designer understood light better than the men who would be looking for it. The sniper carries a Carabiner 98 with a 4-power Zeiss scope. He has 60 confirmed kills on the Eastern Front. He knows his trade. 2 hours pass. He watches the field in front of him. The gap in the far hedgerow, the track worn faintly into the grass by feet that have crossed there before, the corner of a stone barn 200 yards to the left where American troops were seen to shelter the previous afternoon. A runner had crossed through the gap at 8 the morning before. At 8:15, a second man had come through the same gap, moving toward the barn. The sniper had waited. He wanted the pattern. He wanted the third man. He had learned patience on the Dnieper and the Dniester. In those places, patience paid. The third man does not come through the gap. A figure appears instead at the far left corner of the field, crossing at an angle the sniper has not observed before, moving fast and low. By the time the sniper swings his scope, the man has reached a shallow ditch and disappeared. The following morning, the sniper moves to a new position overlooking the track to the barn. He waits again. American soldiers appear and move, but they do not cross where the men crossed the day before. They use a gap through the bank 30 yards further west. The morning after that, a different route entirely. After 5 days, he is fired twice. Both shots at opportunity targets who crossed briefly into a field he was covering. He does not know whether either man died. He has not been able to build the geometry that defined his work in the East. He has no pattern. The Americans seem to arrive from wherever they choose and depart by routes they have not used before, and the record of their movement on the ground is nothing he can read. He is not afraid. He is baffled. That word surfaces in German accounts of the Western Front in the autumn and winter of 1944 and in 1945 with a frequency that draws notice. Not defeated, not outgunned, though the Americans had firepower enough. Baffled. The word in German is unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. It appears in field interrogation reports, in the post-war memoirs of surviving snipers, in the debriefs of men who had killed hundreds of Soviet soldiers with a system they had come to trust as reliable as mathematics, and who found that system producing nothing on the other side of the Western Front. To understand what the German sniper was encountering, and why his confusion was the product of something he had no way to see, it is necessary to go back to where German sniping was born, and to understand just how good it was, and how completely it had been designed around a single assumption that the Americans had quietly already broken. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. The Wehrmacht did not begin the war with a serious sniper capability. The Treaty of Versailles had constrained German precision weapons development for 2 decades, and the early campaigns in Poland and France were won by speed and armor, not by patience in the grass. What built German sniping was the Eastern Front. When German forces drove into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, they encountered Soviet snipers operating with a professionalism that German divisional commanders had not anticipated. From concealed positions in the rubble of Stalingrad, from the tree lines of Belarus and the wheat fields of Ukraine, Soviet marksmen began picking off German officers, artillery observers, machine gun crews, and runners with a systematic precision that bled German units of their most experienced men. By the end of 1941, German divisional headquarters were filing urgent requests for a countermeasure. The response was methodical. The Wehrmacht established its first centralized sniper school in 1942, with additional facilities following in 1943 and 1944. The Waffen-SS ran its own program. The curriculum that emerged from those schools was built around a single operational insight that defined everything that followed. A sniper does not hunt soldiers. A sniper hunts routines. Sepp Allerberger, an Austrian conscript who became the second highest scoring sniper of the entire Wehrmacht with 257 confirmed kills, attended the course in 1943. His wartime notebooks, compiled after the war, described the method as it was taught. You did not begin by firing. You began by watching. Days, in some cases, before a round was chambered. You mapped the ground in front of you with the patience of a surveyor. Where men went to carry water, where the latrines had been dug, which communication trench connected the forward position to the supply point, which paths the messengers ran between positions, at what intervals the sentries changed, and which sections they paced. The Eastern Front was built for this. Soviet forces in 1942 and 1943 operated largely from trench systems that had been excavated over weeks or months. The communication trenches ran between fixed points. The wells and the kitchens and the ammunition stores sat where they had always sat. A soldier going off the established path went in a mud, wire, or minefield. The pattern was structural. The habit was not weakness. It was the logical product of the terrain and the operational situation the men were living in. Once a German sniper had mapped the routine, the killing became procedure. He did not need to find a target. He needed only to be in position before the target arrived at a place where targets always arrived. Matthias Hetzenaar, the highest-scoring Wehrmacht sniper with 345 confirmed kills, operated this way across the southern sectors of the Eastern Front. So did Allerberger. So did the unnamed thousands of German marksmen who had cut through Soviet officer ranks in the approaches to Kursk and along the banks of the Dnieper. They were not, as later films would have it, duelists waiting for a single adversary. They were professionals running a system of observation and prediction, and the Eastern Front had refined that system to a lethal peak. The enemy behaved. The sniper read the behavior. The kill followed as inevitably as the third verse of a known song. In the spring of 1944, German commanders began rotating experienced sniper personnel westward. The men arriving in France carried with them an enormous confidence built on numbers. They had been decorated. Many wore the Iron Cross First Class and the German Cross in gold. Some wore the Knight's Cross. They had good reason to trust what they knew. They had built their kills on a method that worked, tested in the harshest environment the war had produced. The assumption they carried west with them, the assumption baked into every week of their training, was that disciplined troops under combat conditions would, over time, develop the predictable routines that the method required. It had never been tested against an army that had been ordered, in writing, not to do that. The document that broke the German sniper system was not a weapon. It had no moving parts. It was printed on paper by the United States War Department and distributed across the entire American Army during the spring of 1944. Its official designation was Field Manual 21-75, Scouting, Patrolling, and Sniping. Its publication date was the 6th of February, 1944. Inside the manual, on the pages governing the conduct of reconnaissance patrols, there was a single instruction. The text read, "The scout should not return by the same route. His best guide to his return is his memory of the landmarks passed on the way out." 24 words. No elaboration of why. No reference to sniper doctrine. No theory of pattern and observation. It was written in the same flat tone the manual used to describe cleaning a rifle or constructing an outguard position. But those 24 words were the precise, written negation of everything the German sniper school had been built to exploit. The doctrine had a specific institutional history. The United States Army Infantry School at Fort Benning, Georgia had been developing its approach to small unit movement through the 1930s and into the early 40s, drawing from officer observations of the First World War. American liaison officers with Allied and associated forces on the Western Front had documented how German artillery and machine gun crews tracked the movement paths of supply parties, runner routes, and patrol lines, and exterminated them over time by waiting at the known points. The lesson the infantry school drew was unambiguous. Routes are weapons in the enemy's hands. A path used twice belongs to the man watching it. By 1944, the doctrine had filtered into every level of American infantry training. It appeared in FM 21-75 and in the small pocket pamphlets issued to platoon leaders. It was drilled into officer candidates at Fort Benning. It was repeated by veteran sergeants in the standing instructions they handed to replacements. A soldier arriving at Omaha Beach in June of 1944 had been told, in some form, at some point in his training, that the path he had just walked was now the property of whoever might be watching. He was not to use it again. The first weeks in Normandy did not look like a victory for this doctrine. The Norman Bocage, the network of earthen banks 4 to 6 feet high, crowned with centuries of hedge growth, draining into sunken lanes too narrow for armored vehicles, was terrain so enclosed and so irregular that the German defenders could exploit every feature. American casualty reports from June and early July record sniper hits in numbers that shocked officers who had fought in North Africa and Sicily. The terrain forced American troops through predictable choke points. The gaps in the banks, the corners of fields, the approaches to farmyard gates. These were the geometrically inevitable passages through the country, and the Germans were waiting at them. The official account of Sergeant Worm of the 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, taken from the Imperial War Museum's records of that period, describes a pre-dawn patrol of 3 men on the 18th of June, 1944. The patrol moved down a lane and entered a field through a gate. 30 yards in, a German rifleman who had been watching that gate fired from concealment. The round entered through the neck and exited the back. Worm survived. 2 of his patrol did not. Across the American sector through June and into July, similar accounts accumulated. The German snipers operating in the Bocage in those first weeks were running up kill counts that drew comparisons to the Eastern Front. They believed they were winning the sniping war. From the evidence available to them at the time, they had reason to. Green American replacements were moving in patterns the trained observer could read. Officers were standing in exposed positions where they could be seen giving orders. Runners were taking routes that had been used the day before. The Bocage looked, to the German sniper behind his roots, like Belarus with worse food. 2 things were developing beneath that surface that the German observer had no way to perceive. The first was attrition as education. By mid-July, the rifle companies in Normandy contained a different kind of American soldier than the one who had crossed the beach in June. The replacements who survived the first 3 weeks had watched lieutenants be shot, sergeants be killed, experienced men cut down in exactly the positions and at exactly the moments that made clear what was being done to them. The survivors were learning the lesson that no training depot can teach. They were applying, with the urgency of men who had seen what happened when the doctrine was ignored, the 24 words they had been given before they left England. The second thing developing was structural. The American units rotating through the Bocage were running the doctrine at the unit level, not just as individual soldiers walking home by different paths, but as squads and platoons deliberately varying their approaches to every position, every supply route, every observation post. The sergeant who had watched his predecessor stand twice in the same farmyard corner before a sniper found him did not stand in that corner at all. By August of 1944, the pattern in the German interrogation reports had begun to shift. The early prisoner statements from June and July described American infantry as green, slow, and predictable. The August and September statements described something the interrogators noted as a consistent theme. American troops, the prisoners said, did not use the same ground twice. Routes they had used were abandoned. Positions they had occupied were not reoccupied. Gaps through banks that had carried American traffic one day were empty the next, replaced by a new gap cut through a different section of the same bank. German snipers working from positions that should have been ideally placed to intercept American movement were finding that the movement had simply gone elsewhere by a route that had not existed the day before. The confusion this generated in professional men who had built their entire operational method on the opposite assumption was not a small thing. The German sniper school had spent years building a system of observation and prediction so refined that it had dismantled Soviet defensive positions from the inside, killing the officers and observers who held them together faster than the Soviets could replace them. The system worked by reading the enemy. The enemy could be read because the enemy, under the pressures of mass conscription and fixed trench warfare, had no choice but to develop patterns. The discipline the Soviet army imposed on its men was a discipline of action. Do this. Go here. Carry the water along this route. Be in this trench at this hour. The American army had imposed a discipline of a different kind. Behave in such a way that your behavior cannot be read. Walk a different way back. Never the same trail twice. The first kind of discipline produced order. The second kind produced order at the command level and unpredictability at the level of the individual body in the field. The German sniper system had never been designed to read that second kind of discipline because no army it had previously faced had required it of every man on the line. This is where the German term unbegreiflich acquired its precision. The snipers describing their Western Front experience were not using the word loosely. They meant it in the literal sense. The system they had been trained to operate had broken down at its input stage. The data collection, the days of patient observation that preceded a kill, was yielding nothing usable because the data itself had been scrambled. The third man, the fourth man, the man who was supposed to follow the route the first two had walked and confirm it as a permanent line, that man was walking somewhere else. The apparatus of prediction had no slot for that output. In the Hurtgen Forest from September of 1944 through December, the German sniper should have been at his most lethal. 50 square miles of dense conifer, short visibility, trails limited to a handful of established paths through deep gorges and steep ridgelines. The Americans had to pass through the same choke points repeatedly. The conditions the German sniper schools had trained for, fixed approaches, channel movement, force predictability, were there in abundance. American losses in the Hurtgen were staggering. Between 33,000 and 55,000 casualties across the operation, depending on how the boundary dates are drawn. 3 of the 4 divisions fed into the forest in the autumn required substantial rebuilding from replacements. The casualty breakdown, however, tells a specific story. The losses came from artillery, mortar fire, machine guns at intersection points, mines, booby traps, and the cold. The sniper contribution, in terrain where snipers should have been primary inflictor of officer casualties, was substantially lower than the conditions warranted. The post-war German accounts of the Hurtgen express something that reads as professional frustration. They had the terrain. They had trained men. They had prepared positions in the conifers that gave them concealment and elevation and fields of fire. What they did not have, what they had stopped having since the summer, was an enemy whose path could be anticipated. The doctrine of FM 2175 had by November of 1944 been in the muscle memory of the American divisions doing the fighting for the better part of 5 months. The 1st Infantry Division had been in contact since June. The 4th and the 9th had each absorbed enough attrition that the habits of survival had become reflexive. The 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division, under Colonel Charles T. Lanham, a 42-year-old West Point graduate who had earlier served as an instructor at the infantry school at Fort Benning and had personally contributed to drafting the manuals his men now carried, entered the Hurtgen on the 16th of November. By the time it was relieved, the regiment had lost nearly 2,800 casualties, more than 3/4 of its fighting strength. Almost none had been killed by sniper fire. The sniper was not absent. He was there. He was watching. He was simply watching ground that was no longer delivering the information the method required. The trails he covered were used once and then abandoned. The gap through the tree-line that American troops crossed on Monday was not crossed again on Tuesday. The route to the forward observation post traced a different line through the trees each night. The German sniper, patient and skilled, was sitting in a position built for an enemy that did not show up the same way twice. The interrogation reports of German prisoners in late 1944 and into 45 carry the record of this collision. American intelligence officers noted a consistent theme in the statements of captured German soldiers who had served as snipers or in sniper support roles. The Americans, the prisoners said, behaved in ways that produced no readable pattern. Disciplined troops were supposed to behave in patterns. The pressure of combat, the weight of repetitive operational requirements, the physical geography of the front, all of these should have forced the Americans into the geometry that the German observation method was designed to read. The Americans were not producing that geometry. The movements looked random. The same German prisoners did not think the Americans were chaotic or untrained. They thought the absence of pattern was itself inexplicable. One prisoner's statement, recorded by an American intelligence officer in November of 1944 and preserved in the Army's Combat Lessons series, put it with a precision that survived translation. They did not use the same ground twice. No further analysis. No complaint of outright defeat. The professional observation of a craftsman looking at work he cannot account for. The craftsman's confusion is worth dwelling on, because it was not the confusion of a man who had simply been beaten at his own game. The German sniper, who found himself waiting in the Hurtgen with no data to read, was not defeated in the way a rifleman is defeated when a better shot takes him. He was not outranged or outgunned in the direct sense. He had been rendered operationally inert by an idea that had been drilled into his enemy months before either of them arrived in those trees. The sniper's tool, patience, observation, prediction, had been stripped of its material. You cannot read a pattern that has been forbidden to form. To understand the full weight of that, it helps to trace what the American Army had built on top of those 24 words. FM 21, 75 was not operating alone by the autumn of 1944. It was the foundation of a counter-sniper system that used the doctrine of varied routes as its essential first stage, and then, once the foundation was solid, added a second element that the German sniper schools had not anticipated and could not answer once they recognized it. The technique was simple enough to describe in a sentence. Bait the sniper. Map the shot. Call the fire. The execution was something else. It worked because of the varied routes. That is the point that cannot be overstated. The bait, a soldier crossing a field, moving deliberately across a suspected line of fire, was credible to the German observer only because American soldiers genuinely did not move in patterns. A German sniper who had spent 3 days watching a sector and seen American troops use different ground on every crossing had no framework for suspecting that a particular crossing was staged. The man he watched step into his field of fire looked like every other American soldier he had observed across that autumn. A man going somewhere by a route that had not been used before. When the sniper fired, he gave his position. The team waiting for that shot was usually small. 2 riflemen to provide immediate suppression, a forward observer carrying a radio connected to a supporting artillery battery, sometimes a designated American marksman who could attempt a countershot if the geometry allowed. The forward observer's job was to read the line of the incoming round, translate it to a 6-digit grid coordinate, and put that coordinate across the radio before the German could move. By late 1944, an American artillery battery had been trained and rehearsed to drop shells on a called coordinate inside 3 minutes of a fire mission request. The German sniper who had fired a single shot at what appeared to be an unguarded target now had fewer than 3 minutes to vacate a position he had often spent hours preparing. The Army's own post-war studies, drawing from after-action reports filed across the European theater in the final 8 months of the war, documented the casualty-exchange ratio this combination produced. It was not flattering to the German side. The sniper who had on the Eastern Front been a force multiplier capable of immobilizing an entire Soviet company, killing the officers, the radio operators, the platoon sergeants in sequence until the unit went to ground and stayed there, found on the Western Front that a single reveal of his position could produce his death within minutes. The math of his trade had inverted. Firing cost more than it bought. The accounts that survive from German snipers who operated through the autumn and winter of 1944 describe the change in experiential rather than doctrinal terms. The men who kept notebooks, Allerberger being the best documented, though not the only one, recorded a growing awareness that the method was running dry. Positions that should have been productive were not producing. Days of observation were yielding fewer usable patterns than a single morning on the Eastern Front had once provided. And when shots were taken, the response was faster and heavier than anything the Eastern Front had prepared them for. Soviet counter-battery fire in 1943 had been slow and often poorly aimed. American artillery in 1944 was neither. The doctrine of route variation in FM 21, 75 was the product of a long, unglamorous institutional process that had been running since the infantry school drew its lessons from First World War observation reports in the 1920s and 30s. The conclusion, routes used or routes given to the enemy, was not a tactical innovation. It was a disciplinary one. The question the infantry school had asked was not how do we defeat a sniper. The question was how do we prevent the sniper from having the data he needs to operate. The answer, worked out over 2 decades before either question was tested in a Norman hedgerow, was that you deny him the data at the source. You train every man on the line to produce behavior that the sniper's apparatus cannot process. That answer was written into a manual. The manual was distributed, and several million American soldiers were told, in language as dry and specific as a cleaning instruction, to walk a different way home. There is a specific soldier who stands, in the record, as the representative figure of what the doctrine meant when it was applied at the level of the individual man under fire. Private Joseph Dobrowolski of the 22nd Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, is not a famous name. He appears in the unit history once, in a list of men who survived the Hurtgen. He appears in no medal citation and in no memoir that has been published. He is the kind of soldier who makes up 90% of any army's fighting strength and who leaves, when the war ends, almost no trace in the official record except the notation that he was present and then that he was discharged. What Dobrowolski and the thousands of men whose names appear once in unit rosters and never again have in common is that they were given a rule before they crossed the Atlantic, and they followed it in the field, under conditions that offered them every reason to take the easier path, the familiar lane, the gap they had used the day before because they knew it and it was dark and they were tired. The men who took those easy paths are in different lists. The men who follow the rule are in the lists of the living. The German sniper waiting in his pine tree in the Hurtgen in November of 1944 had no way to know that the absence of pattern in front of him was the product of an institutional decision made in Georgia more than a decade before. He knew only that the data his system required was not arriving. He could not manufacture it from nothing. He could not force the Americans to use the same ground twice by waiting for them to do so. He could fire at opportunity. The man who briefly crossed a clearing, the runner who appeared for a second at the edge of a tree line, but the systematic kill sequence that had brought him his kills in the East, the sequence built on 3 days of observation and a shot at a confirmed routine, was not available to him. What he experienced as incomprehensible was the operational expression of a doctrinal asymmetry so fundamental that neither side had a language for it at the time. The Germans had built a sniper system around the assumption that combat would produce pattern behavior, because it always had. The Americans had built a counter to a pattern-based threat without knowing in 1944 specifically what German sniper doctrine looked like at the operational level. FM 2175 did not reference German sniper practice. It did not describe the observation method or the kill sequence. The manual's authors at Fort Benning in the early 40s had not read Allerberger's training notes. They had read First World War reports about artillery registration on known paths, and they had extrapolated forward. The solution they wrote, vary the route, happened to be the precise counter to a threat the Americans did not yet know would appear in the form it took in 1944. The accidental precision of that match is one of the more striking features of the documentary record. The Americans solved a problem they had not fully defined against a threat they had not fully anticipated, and the solution worked because the underlying logic, deny the observer his data, was sound regardless of whether the observer was a German sniper with a Zeiss scope or a German artillery officer with a map and a survey team. The route that is never used twice cannot be registered. The man who never appears in the same place at the same time cannot be targeted by a system that requires him to do both. The doctrine was general enough to work against every threat that exploited human habit, which is a larger category than any single army sniper school. By December of 1944 and into the Ardennes offensive, the German army's sniper capability on the Western Front had been reduced to a shadow of what it had been at its Eastern Front peak. The men were still there. Some of them were still very good. Individual engagements still produced German sniper kills, and American officers were still being careful about where they stood and how they moved in exposed ground. But the systematic operational impact, the dismantling of Soviet company cohesion that German snipers had achieved on the Eastern Front by killing the command structure in sequence, was not being reproduced on the Western Front. The American formations that absorbed the Ardennes offensive in December 1944 and ground it to a halt through January 1945 were not formations that had been bled of their officers and sergeants by German sniper fire. Their officer casualties came from artillery, from the cold, from the desperate close-range fighting in the villages of the Ardennes. The sniper, who in a different kind of war would have been a primary instrument for decapitating those formations at the platoon and company level, had been reduced to an opportunist. The Ardennes itself produced one specific incident that the Army's after-action records document as an illustration of how thoroughly the counter-sniper doctrine had been absorbed by late 1944. A German sniper pair, operating in the tree line east of Bastogne in late December, had established a position covering a supply route used by American logistics vehicles moving to the surrounded garrison. Over the course of 3 days, they killed 2 drivers and wounded a third. On the fourth day, the route was no longer used. American supply parties to Bastogne moved by a different track that had not previously been used. Allerberger survived the war. He was captured by American forces in late April or early May of 1945 as his unit, the 3rd Mountain Division, was collapsing back through Austria. His post-war account describes his final weeks of combat against American troops as a different kind of warfare from the one that had built his record in the East. The patience that had brought him 257 kills against the Red Army was producing diminishing returns. The men he could see were not following the trails he had mapped. When he fired, the response came in volume, and with a speed he found unsettling even in recollection. The exchange ratio that had defined his career, 1 German sniper, 1 bullet, 1 confirmed kill, no counterfire to worry about, had been replaced by something he did not have a professional vocabulary for. He was not the only one. The field interrogation records assembled by American G2 officers in the autumn and winter of 1944 carry, across dozens of separate prisoner statements, the same recurring complaint in different forms. The Americans were not following the trails. The Americans responded to any revealed sniper position with artillery inside a window that left no margin for relocation. The ground that the German snipers' training told him was ideal, the Hurtgen's dense trees, the Siegfried Line's prepared fighting positions, the Ardennes frozen ridge lines, was not producing the kill ratios the terrain should have supported. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. The German army did attempt to adapt. By the end of 1944, sniper schools, still operating within the shrinking Reich, were revising their curriculum. The emphasis shifted toward faster movement between positions, entering, firing, withdrawing, and repositioning before any counterfire could arrive. The wait-and-read method of the Eastern Front gave way, in theory at least, to an aggressive mobile technique that attempted to compress the observation phase and multiply the number of positions a sniper used in a single day. A man who could fire and vanish before the radio call went through could theoretically deny the counter-sniper team the time it needed. The adaptation had a fatal problem. It required what the German army no longer had in sufficient supply: trained men who could execute a complex, physically demanding, and cognitively sophisticated mobile doctrine at the same time as the broader front was consuming experienced personnel faster than the replacement system could generate them. The men who had been schooled in Eastern Front methods were still in the field, still running the observation and patience technique against an enemy that had made that technique hollow. Retraining them required time. Time, by the winter of 1944, was the one resource the German army had run out of before all others. The deeper problem was philosophical, and the German professional soldiers who tried to articulate it after the war kept arriving at the same wall. They could describe what the Americans were doing. They could observe that the routes were varied, that the patterns were absent, that the counterfire arrived with a speed that defied what they knew about artillery coordination. What they could not place inside their professional framework was why an army would train its soldiers to do this as a matter of written, distributed, universal doctrine applied equally to the rifleman from Iowa crossing a field in the Hurtgen and the runner carrying orders between platoon and company headquarters in the Siegfried Line approaches. The German soldier who varied his route was making a tactical decision in response to a specific local situation he had assessed. The American soldier who varied his route was following a rule. The rule was the same for every man, everywhere, regardless of local situation. That distinction, tactical choice versus doctrinal absolute, is what made the system unbeatable within its own terms. A sniper can learn to read the tactical choices of an experienced opponent. He can account for the veteran who changes his route because he is experienced enough to sense that a particular lane is dangerous. The German sniper schools had produced men who could read that kind of opponent. They had produced men who understood how experienced soldiers moved and thought, and instinctively protected themselves. What they had not produced, what no sniper school in any army had thought to produce, because no army had previously presented the problem, was a man who could read an opponent who was varying his routes not because he sensed danger, but because a paragraph in a manual told him to, regardless of whether he sensed anything at all. The American soldier walking a different way home did not always know why he was doing it. Many of the men who survived the Bocage and the Hurtgen and the Rhine crossings did not, when they spoke about the war decades later, connect their survival to any specific piece of doctrine. They knew they walked different routes because their sergeants had told them to, because the platoon leader had made his standing order, because the man who had not done it had been carried to the rear on a stretcher, and the man who had done it was still alive. The survival selection that the Bocage imposed in June and July of 1944 had made the doctrine reflexive long before it became remembered. By autumn the rule was habit. By winter the habit was invisible. This is what makes the German soldiers' post-war accounts so precise in their frustration. They were not describing an enemy who had beaten them. They were describing an enemy who had removed the precondition for being beaten in the way the German method required. A machine that cannot find its input cannot produce its output. The German sniper system was a machine for turning observed human habit into confirmed kills. The Americans had removed the observed human habit. The machine kept running. It produced nothing. The question the German professional accounts keep circling without quite reaching is, how did the Americans know to do this? The answer is not glamorous. There was no single genius at Fort Benning who had read a theoretical paper on German sniper doctrine and reverse-engineered a counter. The sniper pair waited 2 more days for traffic that did not come. On the 6th day, their position was identified by an American forward observer who had been tasked specifically to watch that tree line, and artillery fire was called on it. The German accounts of what followed are not available. The American after-action report notes only that sniper fire on that route ceased. That small incident contains the entire mechanism. The sniper established a position. He fired on a route. The route was abandoned. A counter team identified the position. Artillery solved it. The doctrine, from the 24 words in the patrol manual to the forward observer's radio call, had run its sequence without a single American soldier crossing the line that the German marksmen were waiting to cover. The men who built this system did not, for the most part, understand the full extent of what they had built. The officers at Fort Benning who drafted the route variation doctrine in the 30s were solving a specific tactical problem identified in historical reports. They were not constructing a strategic counter to German sniper doctrine because that doctrine, in 1944's form, did not yet exist when they were writing. They were doing what institutional military education does when it functions as it should, drawing a general lesson from a specific historical failure and encoding it in language simple enough that a frightened 19-year-old could follow in the dark. The general lesson was that the enemy uses human habit as a targeting system. The specific form of that system varies by army and by era, but the underlying principle does not. Men under pressure develop routines. Routines can be predicted. Predicted positions can be killed. The counter to all of it begins with the same 24 words. Walk a different way home. What the Hurtgen and the Ardennes and the Rhine crossing had demonstrated, across 6 months of grinding contact between American infantry and the most experienced German defenders the Wehrmacht could put in the field, was that 24 words in a manual, drilled into enough men with enough consistency over enough time, could break a sniper system that had taken 3 years to build and had killed its hundreds against an enemy that had never thought to forbid the routine. The German professional soldier who emerged from captivity in 1945 and tried to account for what had happened to him on the Western Front kept returning to that wall. He had done his job. His training had been thorough. His positions had been chosen with care. His observation had been patient and skilled. The Americans had still not given him what he needed. He had spent months waiting for a third man who had been instructed, before he ever crossed the channel, never to be the third man on any path the first 2 men had already used. The system that defeated the German sniper was not built by snipers. It was built by administrators of doctrine who had decided, years before the war began, that the right way to protect a soldier was to make his movement unpredictable at the unit level, as a matter of written instruction, applied universally, regardless of whether the individual soldier understood the threat the instruction was designed to counter. That decision, distributed in a manual on the 6th of February, 1944, arrived in Normandy in June, took casualties in July, absorbed its lessons through the summer, and by November was running in the Hurtgen as pure reflex in the bones of men who had long since stopped thinking about it. The spring of 1945 did not look like victory from the inside. The men crossing the Rhine in March were not thinking about what they had built or what they had broken. They were thinking about the far bank, the current, the weight of their equipment, and the men ahead of them who were drawing fire. The doctrine they carried had long since stopped being doctrine. It was reflex. It was the way a soldier moved through ground the way a man breathes, without deciding to. The German army that received them on the far bank was not the army that had crossed into France in 1940. It was a machine running on institutional memory and the accumulated skill of men who had survived 4 years of the hardest fighting the 20th century had yet produced. The snipers still among them were some of the best marksmen alive. Their eyes were still good. Their patience had not diminished. The Zeiss glass they carried still resolved at 400 yards with a clarity that made a man's face readable at a distance where he believed himself invisible. What those eyes could not find was a target that behaved the way targets were supposed to behave. The Rhine crossings in March of 1945 produced a category of German prisoner report that American GI officers noted with particular attention. Captured snipers and marksmen taken in the weeks following the Remagen bridgehead described the same operational experience across dozens of separate interrogations conducted at different points along the front. The Americans moved in ways that produced nothing to shoot at by the time the scope settled. Routes used in the morning were gone by afternoon, replaced by paths that cut through ground the observer had not covered. Positions the Americans had occupied for 2 days were abandoned without apparent reason and replaced by positions that appeared elsewhere, set back from the obvious ground, covering angles that the textbook said were suboptimal and that turned out not to be. The men questioning these prisoners noted in their reports that the Germans were not describing confusion. They were describing a professional adversary whose professionalism expressed itself in a way their training had given them no category for. The bridgehead at Remagen held because of artillery, because of engineers, because of the particular stubbornness of American infantry units that had been fighting since Normandy and had absorbed the lessons of every lane and every hedgerow gap in that country. It held also because the German snipers covering the approaches to the bridge could not fix American movement into the geometry their method required. The men crossing that bridge used it once and moved on. The men establishing positions on the far bank did not occupy the obvious ground. They had been told not to, and the telling had become habit months before they reached the Rhine. The 9th Armored Division's after-action report for the period covering the Remagen seizure notes, in the flat language of military administrative prose, that sniper casualties among the units securing the bridgehead were lower than the tactical situation warranted. The report does not explain why. It records the fact and moves on. The explanation lives in a different document, written years before a fort bending, and in the muscle memory of men who had stopped thinking about it as a rule somewhere between the Hurtgen and the Ruhr. There is a tendency, in the decades since the war ended, to explain American success in the European theater through the large numbers, the production figures, the shipping tonnage, the artillery rounds expended per mile of advance. Those numbers are real, and they mattered. A war economy that could produce more Sherman tanks than the enemy could destroy, more artillery shells than any defensive line could absorb, more replacement infantry than any sniper could whittle down, is an economy that wins wars of attrition regardless of the tactical skill of the men on either side. The argument is not wrong. It is incomplete. What the production figures cannot account for is the specific failure of the German sniper system on the Western Front, because that failure was not a failure of material. The Germans had enough ammunition. They had enough glass. They had men of genuine and documented skill operating in terrain that should have been ideal. The failure was informational. The input the system required was not available because the men the system was pointed at had been instructed, at the level of written doctrine, to deny it that input. No production figure explains that. No shipping tonnage accounts for it. It was an idea, written on paper, distributed in a manual, and drilled into enough men consistently enough that it became the way American soldiers moved through ground as naturally as they breathed. The men who came home from Europe in 1945 and 1946 did not, by and large, give interviews about route variation doctrine. They did not write memoirs about FM 2175. The veterans who published accounts of their time in Normandy and the Hurtgen and the Rhineland wrote about the cold and the mud and the faces of the men who did not come back. The doctrine was not the story they carried. It was the condition under which they had carried every other story. What remained, when the veterans had gone home and the after-action reports had been filed and the manuals had been revised and reissued for the next war, was a documentary record that told a specific and verifiable story about how an institutional decision made in Georgia in the 1930s had intersected with a battlefield reality in France and Germany in 1944 and 45, and produced an outcome that the men on both sides of it could feel but not fully name. The German snipers who survived the war and wrote about it were, almost without exception, men who had built their records on the Eastern Front and found the Western Front a different and diminishing experience. Allerberger's account is the most detailed and the most cited, but it is not unique. The pattern across the survivor accounts is consistent enough to constitute a body of evidence. The system worked until it met an army that had been ordered to break its input conditions. When that happened, the system kept running and produced nothing, and the men running it had no framework for understanding why, because the army they were facing had not defeated the system in any way they could identify as defeat. The Americans had not outsniped them. They had not developed a superior optic or a better camouflage pattern or a more patient observer. They had simply distributed a rule and enforced it long enough that it became invisible, and the invisibility of the rule was precisely what made it unbeatable. The ground where this played out still exists. The Bocage of Normandy has changed in 80 years, but its bones have not. The sunken lanes are still there. The earthen banks still carry their hedge growth. The gaps through which men moved in June and July of 1944 are still recognizable to anyone who walks that country with a map from that summer in their hand. The Hurtgen Forest is still dense and dark and steep, and the tree lines that German snipers worked from in November of 1944 still give the same elevation and the same fields of fire they gave then. The ground has not forgotten what happened on it. The ground simply does not record which paths the Americans chose not to use twice. That absence is the whole story. The evidence that survived is the evidence of what the German method could do when it found its conditions met, and the evidence of what happened when those conditions were removed. The gap in the record, the routes never taken, the positions never reoccupied, the third man who never appeared, is not a gap from loss or destruction. It is a gap that was put there deliberately, by men following a rule they had been given before they crossed the Atlantic, in a manual printed on the 6th of February, 1944. The sniper in his tree in the Hurtgen did not know that. He knew only that the ground in front of him was not giving him what ground was supposed to give. He waited with the patience his training had built over years and thousands of hours, and 200-odd confirmed kills on a different front. The patience was real. The skill behind it was real. The system it served had simply run out of material to work with, because the material had been told, in writing, by an institution that had been thinking about this problem since before the war began, to stop being material. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, 1945. The men who had carried FM-21, 75 across Normandy, and the Hurtgen and the Rhine came home to places that had not been fought over, to streets they could walk any way they chose, to a life in which the rule about routes had no application and no urgency. Most of them let it go without ceremony. It had kept them alive. That was sufficient. They did not need to understand the mechanism to have benefited from it, any more than a man needs to understand hydraulics to cross a bridge. The document itself was revised and reissued. The 24 words survive the revision. They are still, in various forms, present in American small unit infantry doctrine. The specific threat they were written to counter has changed shape across the decades since 1944, but the underlying logic has not. The enemy uses human habit as a targeting system. The counter begins with the same instruction: walk a different way home. What the Norman Bocage and the Hurtgen Forest and the Rhine crossings demonstrated across 6 months of contact between American infantry and the most experienced defenders the Wehrmacht could put in the field was that the simplest ideas, when they are sound and when they are distributed with enough consistency to become reflex, are also the most durable. The German sniper system was a work of professional and institutional sophistication. It had taken years to build, had been tested in the harshest environment the war produced, and had killed its hundreds with a precision that the men who designed it had every reason to be proud of. It was beaten by a paragraph that asked nothing of the men who carried it except that they not go home the same way they came. The names of most of those men are in lists that no one reads anymore. The unit rosters of the 1st Infantry Division and the 4th and the 9th, the regimental histories of the 22nd Infantry and the 16th and the 18th, The morning reports that recorded who was present and who was not. These documents exist in archives in Maryland and in the regimental associations that kept their records through the post-war decades. The men in them are mostly gone now. What they left behind is not the memory of a doctrine they followed, but the fact that they followed it, and the fact that following it was, in some cases, the difference between their name appearing in the morning report and their name appearing somewhere else. The German sniper who waited in the Hurtgen in November of 1944 for a third man who never came was waiting for something that had been forbidden into non-existence by an administrative decision he could not see and would not have believed if he had been told about it. He was a skilled professional operating a system that worked. The system required data that was not there. He could not manufacture it from patience or from glass or from the particular stillness that had made him lethal in another country against another army. He waited. The trees dripped. The trails in front of him stayed empty. Somewhere behind the American line, men who had stopped thinking about the rule walked back to their positions by routes they had not used before because their sergeants had told them to, because the man who had not done it had gone to the rear on a stretcher, because it was the way they moved now, the way they had moved for months, the way they would move until the war ended and there was no more ground to cross. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.